Welcome back, everyone. And before we get into another sermon outline form, I thought I would take a few minutes now to just give you a little bit of a look at some textbooks on preaching that may be of interest to you, and you may want to read or grab one or more of these books. So I mentioned earlier Dr. Paul Scott Wilson, and I've got two of his books here. One is one I mentioned already. It's called The 4 Pages of the Sermon, and great book, and highly recommend taking a look at this one. And another book written by Paul is Setting Words on Fire, Putting God at the Center of the Sermon. And one of the things he does in that book is he talks about the difference between teaching and preaching. And instead of using the word preaching to describe what he's trying to convey, Paul uses the term proclamation. And he says there are moments in the sermon for teaching, there are moments for explanation, there are moments for application, but then there are moments for proclamation, when there's exhortation, there's encouragement, there is motivational, pastoral guidance and challenge put in front of the congregation. So I think this book kind of addresses the subject of maybe dry preaching, or maybe, preaching that's a little bit too cerebral and doesn't pay as much attention maybe to the heart and the will. So this book kind of tries to say, listen, guys, gals, when you're preaching, put passion into your preaching, and make sure that you're not just kind of going through the motions, I guess, in some ways. And so I found that book very, very helpful. So now let me just give you a few more. This is a great little book here on preaching from, this is an American textbook now, but preaching from a white perspective with Warren Wiersbe, and preaching from a black American perspective with E.K. Bailey. Now, it's called Preaching in Black and White. Now, E.K. Bailey has passed away. He passed away at a young age. He was just in his late 50s. He has a masterpiece sermon. If you can listen to it maybe on YouTube, for example, I think you could find it there. It's called The Testimony of a Tax Collector by E.K. Bailey. And it's one of the best sermons I have ever heard. I highly recommend it. So, yeah, that's Preaching in Black and White. And here's an older book. This is by John Stott, the great British scholar, writer, pastor, preacher. And he does New Testament word studies. And so, for example, in here, he talks about preaching as let me see now, I'll just check this. Preaching as a steward, preaching as a herald, preaching as a witness to the gospel, preaching as a father, love and gentleness being emphasized there. So I'm preaching as a servant. So that's a great little book by John Stott. John Stott, you may know, has another more famous book on preaching called Between Two Worlds, which is a classic. Highly recommend that book as well. Dr. Tim Keller, Communicating Faith in an Age of Skepticism, preacher in New York City, and this book was written in 2015. Great book, highly recommends Tim Keller. This may be a little lesser known book, but this is just an excellent book written by a Canadian, The Glory of Preaching. It's got a really good dose of the theology of preaching as well as the practice of preaching. So another great book. I'm a big fan of Calvin Miller, and Calvin Miller has written a number of books. One is called Narrative Preaching, but this one is probably one of my favorite books. It's called The Sermon Maker. And on one half of the page, or one side of the page, he talks about insights and quotations around the subject of preaching. And on the narrative side of the book, he tells the story of, it's a fictional story, but very true to life, of a preacher who is in a bit of a rut and needs some fresh inspiration. And so it makes us kind of smile at ourselves. And Calvin Miller is a fantastic writer. Highly recommend him. Eugene Lowry, How to Preach a Parable. Some of the unique challenges of preaching parables. So Eugene Lowry, How to Preach a Parable. One of my good friends, Dr. Steve Mathewson, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. And foreword is by Dr. Haddon Robinson. And so Steve and I both studied with Dr. Robinson. And this is a great book. I've used this in my preaching classes at Tyndale over the years. And just a really excellent book on how to preach narrative passages in the Old Testament. You've heard me talk about Fred Craddock. So there's his book called Preaching. And I'll just give you the publication date on this now. This is published in 1985. 1985, Fred Craddock, Preaching. And here's one of his other books that I really, really like. It's called As One Without Authority, Fred Craddock. Great book. He's an excellent writer, easy to read. You may have heard of Andy Stanley. It's his book on preaching here. How do I do that? Communicating for a Change, Andy Stanley. And I'm going to give you a sermon outline based on this format recommended by Andy Stanley in our next segment. Now, The Company of Preachers by Richard Lisher. He's the editor. It does a survey of the history of preaching. It collects a number of articles and excerpts from throughout church history on the subject of preaching, and just rich with all kinds of great insight on the theology and practice of preaching. It's probably my favorite book of all time when it comes to preaching, The Company of Preachers. And this is the Bible for preachers, Biblical Preaching by Haddon Robinson. The Development and Delivery of Expository Messages, Dr. Haddon Robinson. I had the privilege of doing my doctoral studies with him, and he died just a couple of years ago now and has gone home to his eternal reward. Dr. Robinson's son, Torrey Robinson, was in my doctoral program cohort, and I had the privilege of attending Dr. Robinson's funeral in Boston at Gordon Conwell Seminary just a few years ago. I also wanted to mention a commentary, the NIV Application Commentary. This is on Revelation, but I want to recommend the set. It's available digitally on Logos Bible software, or you can buy these in hard copy form. And I really like these because they're designed for the preacher. Every passage has 3 segments. A is the original context, and then B is bridging the context, and then the third section is the contemporary application. So it really deals with the exegesis, it deals with theology, and then it deals with application. So an excellent commentary. The other one that I use as one of my primary commentaries is the Expositor's Commentary. So those two are probably my most frequently resourced commentary sets. Okay, I'll stop right there for this segment, and then we're going to go and do some more sermon outline work.